Look at them! They're tiny! Hey, Julian Kraus here, and here I got the ZOOM AMS-22 and AMS-24 interfaces. I'm going to show you their features, talk a bit about the audio quality, and if you decide they are for you, I'll also help you decide between the two. That even rhymes. By the way, there's also an AMS-24, which I don't have here because the performance is allegedly quite similar to the AMS-24, and I didn't feel like buying the whole lineup, so that one is missing here. But it exists and it offers more in and outputs than the AMS-22 and 24. Let's have a look at the hardware and the differences between the AMS-22 and 24. On the AMS-22 you get one XLR and TRS combo input, which you can plug in microphones or guitars. But because this is only one single input, you can only plug in one at a time, which might be a bit limiting even for a single musician. There is a second input which accepts unbalanced line signals with a stereo 3.5mm TRS input, but to note is that the AMS-22 only supports two inputs at a time, so you can either use the line level input or the XLR and TRS input. If you use both at a time, the left signal from the line level input is mixed together with the XLR input. That could be used for some kind of a mixing functionality, but I guess most of the times you want your channels to be recorded separately. On the front of the interface you can also find a 3.5mm headphone output. The volume can be adjusted with the volume dial on the top. This dial simultaneously controls the main outputs on the back, so you only have one shared control here. On the top you can also find a gain dial, which is absolutely tiny, but at least smooth to turn. It adjusts the gain for the XLR and TRS combo input. The 3.5mm line level input is not affected by the gain dial, so if you record via the line level input, turn down the gain all the way to not introduce any unnecessary noise. I find this a bit strange because while consumer line level signals should all be around a similar level, in practice that's often not the case, and then it is nice to have a way of adjusting your recorded level with a gain dial. But well, that's not how it is on the AMS-22. The left side of the AMS-24 and 22 feature a switch to toggle phantom power for the microphone, and on the right side you can find two more toggles, one to enable direct monitoring and a switch for the integrated loopback feature, which records the output of the PC as well, so that it can be combined with the inputs, which is great when you're performing to background music, and this should be captured as well. On the back of both interfaces you can find two USB connections, one for data and a second one if the first connection does not provide enough power. With the second USB connection you can help out the interface with a power bank or USB charger to keep the interface portable. More about the power situation a little later. And lastly you got a main output on the back in form of two 1/4-inch TRS jacks. I think it's pretty neat that they crammed in full-sized TRS jacks in these tiny interfaces. Compared to the AMS-22, the AMS-24 is a bit bigger, although it is still very small for a two-channel interface. Here is it besides a PreSonus Audio Box Go, which by the way we will also compare the performance against later in this video. On the AMS-24 you get two XLR and TRS combo inputs, and they accept microphone and line level signals. Although the first input can be switched to accommodate guitar signals with the switch at the top. There you also got another switch which lets you control the gain of both inputs with one gain dial, which can be really handy for stereo recording, where you want the gain to be the same for the left and right channel. In the top corner the AMS-24 offers a switch which lets you quickly switch between what Zoom calls music and stream mode. In music mode the inputs of the interface are recorded separately, and in stream mode they are mixed together and presented as one source to the software, which can be quite handy for streaming. Duh. You will also find two knobs to adjust the headphone and main output volume. The AMS-24 features two headphone outputs, one of which is controlled with the output A dial and the second one with the output B dial. Like on the AMS-22, the output A dial controls the headphone and main output volume simultaneously, and the main output can once again be found on the back. The AMS-24 has one more secret feature at the bottom, a battery compartment. Fittingly, there's a toggle for the battery power on the left side, which lets you enable or disable the battery power. By the way, I tested the runtime with battery power and I got 3 hours with pretty old Eneloops rechargeable batteries and one condenser mic connected. With newer batteries and without phantom power, 3.5 to maybe 4 hours seem realistic. I think it's time to explain the whole power situation because it's not as straightforward as I thought it would be. The good news is that both interfaces will work just fine with just one USB-C connection to a PC. Now the AMS-22 sadly did not directly connect to my Samsung S20 and I needed to connect a power bank to the second USB input. The weird thing is that once it turned on and was connected to my phone, I could actually disconnect the power bank and it worked just fine with a single USB connection to the phone. This gives me hope that there can be a firmware update in the future which directly enables the communication so that you don't need a power bank with the AMS-22 for portable use, because let's face it, that pretty much destroys the whole point of buying a portable interface when you have to lug around a power bank to get it to power up. Check the comment section, I will pin a comment if that changes in the future with a firmware update. Why am I confident that this should work? Well, because the AMS-24 does that just fine. It can connect directly to the S20 and it instantly works, no jumpstart with a power bank needed. If my phone would have still not been able to power the AMS-24, then I could have used the battery power to get it to work. On the AMS-22 you sadly don't have this option as there is no battery compartment, so I think it is even more important that on this interface it straight away works with a single connection to a phone. Zoom provides a list of compatible phones on their website and I would check that out specifically if you plan to buy the AMS-22. Alright, it is time to have a look at the audio quality. Generally speaking, the audio quality of the mic inputs is decent. I noticed that on the AMS-22 the frequency response is getting a bit less flat at the maximum gain setting, which is definitely not uncommon. While in practice I doubt that you could notice this could have been better in this regard, and Zoom shows that this is possible as the AMS-24 actually stays much flatter even at the maximum gain setting. In terms of distortion, both interfaces perform equally well, with just a hint showing up at around -90 decibels. I consider this to be inaudible and wouldn't worry about this. Although one thing to notice is that on the AMS-24, the distortion rises towards the lower frequencies. Technically speaking, this is not that great, but I would argue again that in the real world it is unlikely that you will hear that. Here the AMS-22 actually takes the lead, as it shows much less of a rise in distortion at low frequencies. Now, what about preamp noise? Of course you want this to be as low as possible to not hear any noise when you use dynamic microphones. With condenser microphones this is really not a concern because the microphone is the limiting factor in terms of noise, but if you use dynamic mics you definitely want to have the lowest preamp noise possible. In my measurements the numbers were fluctuating by about a dB depending on which XLR input I was using, but on average both AMS interfaces came in at around -121 dBu. How does that sound like in practice? Well, what a coincidence, I'm already using a low sensitive dynamic microphone and this is pretty much a worst case scenario. Let me be quiet for a second so you can have a listen to the noise floor. And here's the noise in comparison to a few other interfaces. As you could hear, the preamp noise of the AMS interfaces is definitely on the higher side. It's not completely terrible, but to be honest in this day and age I really don't understand why Zoom uses high noise preamps, as it is pretty easy and cheap to get much lower noise. Now somebody might add that this can easily be fixed with a fathead or cloud lifter, and they would be right. But that's additional cost and these days you simply shouldn't need these inline preamps anymore. So keep this in mind, because if you primarily use dynamic mics and want to get the lowest noise recordings, the AMS series might not be the best choice. Again, for condenser mics this really is not an issue, as the mic is the limiting factor here. One last thing about the mic input and specifically about noise is the dynamic range. It should be as high as possible so you can leave yourself some headroom to not clip and still achieve a low noise floor. Here the AMS-22 doesn't fare too terribly well with only 92 dB. For easy recording scenarios like speech this is plenty, but if you get more dynamic and want to simultaneously capture louder and quieter sounds, like for example in drumming, then the AMS-22 might run into its limits. The AMS-24, while also not perfect, is quite a bit better with a dynamic range of 101 dB. For singing and the like, I would say the AMS-22 is still completely fine, but with more dynamic sources the AMS-24 simply performs better in terms of noise. The line level input performance is actually very similar to the mic input, so I'm just flipping through the graphs here. Distortion is at a level I consider to be inaudible, the frequency response is nicely flat, And only in the dynamic range chart we see the same difference in performance again as for the mic input. Here the AMS-24 is simply 10 decibels better, which, depending on the things you record, might or might not make an audible difference in noise. I already mentioned that I'm a big fan of the TRS connectors on these small interfaces, so let's have a look at their performance. The frequency response is very flat in both interfaces, just like we like to see. The distortion in both interfaces is at a level where it's audibly non-existent, but one thing I noticed is that there is quite a difference in the maximum output level. The AMS-24 can push a proper 20 dBV professional line level, while the AMS-22 only outputs 4.8 dBV max. That's actually more like consumer line level, which I wouldn't expect on balanced outputs. This can have an impact on dynamic range, and lo and behold, we can see that the AMS-22 only sits around 96 dB. The AMS-24, on the other hand, achieves a very respectable 107 decibels. In practice, I don't expect you to hear any noise from the main output of these interfaces, but with the AMS-24 you can be much more certain of that. By the way, if your studio monitors have a -10 dBV to +4 dBU switch, I suggested to set it to -10 for the AMS-22 and +4 for the AMS-24 to get the best performance. Okay, let's hop over to the headphone output. I will not bore you with all the details, you can see all the numbers and colors indicating the performance on screen. Generally speaking, the headphone outputs are okay, although the AMS-24 is the clear winner here, especially when it comes to noise. With the AMS-22 you might start to hear some noise with more sensitive headphones, and with in-ear monitors you will clearly hear constant background hiss. On the AMS-24 I didn't hear obvious noise with IEMs, and with normal over-ear headphones it is unlikely that you will hear any noise. The AMS-24 also could drive headphones to a louder listening level, and the frequency response was considerably flatter. Because of all these reasons I much preferred the headphone output on the AMS-24. Distortion performance is very comparable though, and actually low enough to not waste any further thoughts on it. Quick notes on the ASIO driver: you have a drop-down to select your different sample rates and a slider for your buffer size. That's it, nothing else. This is pretty much as bare bones as it gets. I checked the latencies, and comparatively speaking they are a bit on the longer side. The very lowest buffer settings also seem to not lower the latency by that much more, so you are probably best off using the second or third lowest buffer size when latency is important for you. Other than that, the measured times are relatively close to what was reported by the driver, which is always good to see. So what do I think about the Zoom AMS-22 and 24? I think they are okay, although in this day and age I do expect a bit better performance from an audio interface. My biggest gripe is the comparatively high preamp noise. If you use condenser mics, this is really not an issue, but if you use dynamic mics, especially low sensitive ones, there's a good chance that you will hear some audible noise in your recordings. These days there is really no good reason anymore to have such high noise preamps. Shame on you, Zoom. While I was already quite critical about the PreSonus Audiobox Go in its review, compared to the AMS-22 I think it's actually a better buy here, especially if you can live with the bigger form factor. Things might get a bit more even if there's a firmware update that lets you directly power the AMS-22 from a phone, but even then the AMS-22 has a higher noise headphone output, which is quite obvious with sensitive headphones, and the preamp noise is also noticeably worse compared to the Audiobox Go. When it comes to the AMS-24, in my opinion, it's a much more compelling option for portable recording, as it usually works with a singular USB connection to a phone. It also has the option to be powered with AA batteries, or if you need a power bank. You also get 2 XLR and TRS combo inputs, 2 headphone outputs, the option to quickly switch between music and streaming mode, and all that in a still very portable package. Alright. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more reviews, and I will see you all in the next one.